For years, Rebecca Langford controlled the conversation, until this black businessman shattered her narrative on live television. The clip spread like wildfire. Millions watched as Rebecca Langford, host of the Langford Report, sat frozen on live television, struggling to find the words to save herself. Just moments earlier, she had been in control, smug, confident, playing the role she had perfected over the years. But now, the mask had slipped, and all it took was Isaiah Brooks, a businessman she had underestimated, calmly laying out the truth in a way no one could ignore. For years, the Langford Report had thrived on controversy. Rebecca had built her career on telling it like it is, though what that really meant was dismissing any conversation about systemic inequality. She had a formula: invite guests with opposing views, mock their perspectives, and reinforce what her audience wanted to hear. It worked. Ratings soared. Sponsors lined up. Her words shaped public discourse, fueling debates long after the cameras stopped rolling. But something was different about this night. Isaiah wasn't just another guest. He wasn't a politician looking for votes, nor an academic buried in statistics. He was a self-made businessman from Indianapolis, a man who had built his wealth in the tech industry despite every obstacle thrown his way. His story wasn't abstract, it was lived experience. And when Rebecca welcomed him onto her show, she believed she could twist that experience to fit her usual narrative. "Welcome, Isaiah," she said, offering a rehearsed smile. "I have to say, it's refreshing to see someone who didn't let excuses hold them back." Isaiah didn't flinch. He had seen this tactic before. Led with a compliment, then pivot into something designed to undermine. "I appreciate the invitation, Rebecca," he replied, his voice even. Looking forward to the conversation, Rebecca leaned in, already setting the stage. "You built your company from the ground up. No handouts, no shortcuts. Would you say that's proof that anyone can make it if they just work hard enough?" The audience clapped, her loyal viewers already nodding along, but Isaiah didn't bite. "I'd say my story proves a lot of things," he answered, measured. "Hard work matters, but so do the obstacles in the way. The real question is, why do some people have to work twice as hard for the same opportunities?" Rebecca smirked. "Come on now, Isaiah. We hear that argument all the time, but you're living proof that success is possible. If you made it, what's stopping anyone else?" And just like that, the game had begun. But Rebecca had no idea that tonight, she was the one about to be exposed. Isaiah knew exactly what Rebecca was doing. He had seen it before: reduce an entire system of inequality to a single success story, then use it as proof that the system wasn't broken at all. It was an old trick, but he wasn't here to play along. He adjusted his posture, his expression calm but firm. "Rebecca, I appreciate the compliment, but let's be real. If one person makes it across a broken bridge, that doesn't mean the bridge isn't broken. It just means they got across despite the danger." Rebecca let out a short laugh, tilting her head as if Isaiah had just proven her point. "So you're saying the bridge is broken? Because I look around, and I see a lot of successful people who worked hard to get where they are." Isaiah nodded. "You do. And do you know what most of them will tell you? That the climb was steeper for some than for others." He turned slightly, looking toward the audience. "Imagine two runners at the starting line. One is on a smooth track. The other, they've got hurdles in front of them. You don't get to say the race is fair just because they both started running at the same time." The audience murmured. Some nodded. Others folded their arms. Rebecca shifted in her chair. She wasn't used to guests controlling the tempo like this. She leaned forward, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "So you're saying hard work doesn't matter?" Isaiah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I never said that. Hard work matters a lot, but so does the fact that some people are running uphill while others have a clear path. And let's not pretend that's accidental." Rebecca's smirk returned. "Let's talk about that then. Because every time we have this discussion, it turns into blaming others instead of taking responsibility. I mean, look at you, Isaiah. You built something incredible. You didn't sit around waiting for help." Isaiah exhaled through his nose, keeping his voice steady. "You're right. I didn't wait. But let's not ignore the fact that I had to be twice as good to get half the credit." Rebecca shook her head, feigning disbelief. "Twice as good? That sounds like an excuse to me. In this country, anyone can—" Isaiah cut in before she could finish. Rebecca, do you know how many times investors told me no before I got my first yes? Do you know how many meetings I walked into where they assumed I wasn't the CEO but someone's assistant? I had to work harder, talk smarter, and prove myself over and over just to get through doors that were already open for others. A murmur rippled through the audience again. Rebecca noticed. She straightened her back, trying to maintain her composure. Well, maybe that's just part of business. Everyone has to work hard. Isaiah nodded slowly. Sure, but let's not pretend the starting line is the same for everyone. Rebecca opened her mouth, ready to respond. But something had shifted. She could feel it. The usual rhythm of her show, the one where she controlled the conversation, was slipping. But instead of backing down, she decided to push even harder. Rebecca's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She could feel the shift in the room, but she wasn't about to let it show. Losing control of a segment was bad for business. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her tone cooling just enough to seem measured. So what exactly are you saying, Isaiah? She asked, her voice laced with skepticism. That success isn't about effort. That people are just victims of the system, and there's nothing they can do about it. Isaiah didn't miss a beat. I'm saying effort isn't the only factor. And if we're serious about equal opportunity, we have to acknowledge that some people have to clear more obstacles than others. Ignoring that doesn't make it disappear. Rebecca shook her head, letting out a short chuckle. See, this is the problem. People like you make it sound like success is impossible unless the entire system is redesigned. But you're sitting right here, proof that anyone can make it. Isaiah tilted his head slightly. You keep using my success as a way to ignore the bigger issue. That's like pointing to a few lucky survivors of a storm and saying the storm wasn't that bad. The audience murmured again. Rebecca's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before she forced a smile. She wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who refused to take the bait. She decided to change her approach. All right, let's be practical, she said, adjusting in her seat. If things are so unfair, what do you suggest? Government handouts? Lowering standards? Isaiah let out a slow breath. He could feel where she was trying to lead the conversation, and he wasn't about to let her take it there. I suggest we stop pretending the playing field is level when it's not. I suggest we acknowledge the barriers instead of dismissing them. And I suggest we have honest conversations instead of twisting reality to fit a comfortable narrative. Rebecca's smile faltered, just for a second. She could feel herself slipping, but she wasn't done yet. She leaned forward again, her voice taking on that authoritative tone she had mastered over the years. You know what I think, Isaiah? I think people don't like hearing the truth. The truth is, success comes down to personal choices. Work hard, make the right decisions, and you'll get ahead. It's really that simple. Isaiah looked at her for a long moment, then exhaled softly, shaking his head. Rebecca, if success was just about making the right choices, how do you explain two people making the same choice and getting different results? She opened her mouth to respond, but he continued. I started my company the same way plenty of others did. But while some of my peers walked into bank meetings and left with funding, I was asked if I had collateral, even with the same numbers, the same pitch. Some of them landed high-profile clients through connections they had without even realizing it, while I had to work twice as hard just to get a foot in the door. Rebecca's fingers drummed against the arm of her chair. So what? You're saying everyone who's successful had it easy? Isaiah shook his head. I'm saying pretending the path is the same for everyone is dishonest. And I think deep down you know that. For the first time in the conversation, Rebecca had nothing to say, and the audience noticed. But Isaiah wasn't done yet. He was about to hit her with something she couldn't dodge. Rebecca's silence lasted only a moment, but it was long enough for the shift to settle. She could feel it. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were listening, and worse, they were questioning. She cleared her throat, forcing a laugh to mask the tension. All right, Isaiah, let's flip this for a second. You say the system is unfair, but weren't you also given advantages? I mean, let's be real. These days, companies are practically throwing money at diversity initiatives. You probably had doors open for you just because of that. A few audience members clapped. It was a weak response, but Rebecca latched onto it, sitting up straighter. Isaiah just stared at her for a second, then let out a quiet, knowing chuckle. Rebecca, Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you were the only white person in the room? Rebecca blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me, it's a simple question, Isaiah said, folding his hands. Have you ever walked into a meeting, a conference or an event, and realized that everyone else in that room was different from you, and that they had already decided what you were capable of before you even spoke? Rebecca hesitated. That's not the same thing, isn't it? Isaiah countered. Because that's my reality. Every room I walked into, I had to prove I wasn't just there because of a diversity quota. I had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but Isaiah wasn't done. And since we're talking about advantages, let's talk about yours. The air in the studio tightened. Rebecca's smirk faltered, but she forced it back. Excuse me? Isaiah leaned forward, his voice steady. Let's talk about how you built your career. About the opportunities you had because of where you grew up, the connections you had, the assumptions people made about you before you even said a word. Let's talk about how you've dismissed conversations like this for years, yet you personally benefited from the very systems you claim don't exist. Rebecca's expression darkened. That's ridiculous. Isaiah didn't flinch. Is it? Because I did some research, Rebecca. She stiffened. You've spent years telling people that privilege isn't real. But here's the funny thing. You got your first media job because your father was friends with the station manager. The audience let out a low murmur. Rebecca's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Isaiah continued. That's not to say you didn't work hard. But let's be honest. Do you really think you would have gotten that job if you had no connections? If your name didn't carry weight? If you had to prove yourself to a room full of people who already assumed you didn't belong? Rebecca's face was unreadable, but her hands were gripping the arms of her chair. Isaiah turned slightly, addressing the audience. See, that's the thing about privilege. It's not about whether you struggled. It's about the fact that some people get a head start without even realizing it. And the moment you bring it up, they get uncomfortable. The studio was silent. Rebecca was silent. But silence wouldn't save her now, because the world was already watching. Rebecca's face was carefully composed, but anyone paying attention could see the tension in her jaw, the stiffness in her shoulders. She wasn't used to being on the defensive, and it showed. The silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable before she forced a laugh. Sharp, humorless. So now I'm the villain? Is that what this is? Isaiah shook his head, his expression calm. This isn't about villains. It's about truth. And the truth is, you've built your career dismissing experiences like mine while benefiting from the very systems you claim don't exist. Rebecca's fingers tapped against her desk, a nervous rhythm she probably didn't even realize she was doing. The audience was watching her now, really watching. Some of them still supported her, but others were seeing something they hadn't noticed before. She cleared her throat, pushing forward. Look, I'm not going to sit here and apologize for working hard. You act like I didn't earn everything I have. Isaiah leaned back slightly, folding his hands. I never said you didn't work hard. I said your path was different. And the fact that you're this defensive about it tells me you know that. Another murmur rippled through the audience. Rebecca's fingers stilled. For the first time in her career, the conversation wasn't bending to her will. And then, just as she was about to regain her footing, the moment that changed everything happened. A producer off camera handed her a phone, something they never did during live segments. She glanced at the screen, her eyes flickering with something unreadable, then looked up sharply. Are you kidding me? She muttered under her breath. She turned toward the control booth, but the damage was already done. The audience could tell something had shifted. Isaiah remained still, waiting. Rebecca forced a smile, but there was no warmth behind it. Well, Isaiah, it looks like you've made quite an impression. My producers just informed me that this segment is trending online. Isaiah raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Rebecca inhaled through her nose. It seems some of our viewers have strong opinions about this discussion. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, was that the clip was already spreading like wildfire and not in the way she wanted. Her show thrived on controversy. But this was different. People weren't just debating. They were dissecting, replaying the moment she faltered, pointing out how she dodged, deflected, tried to maintain control but failed. And the worst part? Advertisers were paying attention. She didn't need a producer to tell her what came next. Calls from executives, sponsors reconsidering their partnerships, the network questioning whether the Langford report was worth the heat. Rebecca looked back at Isaiah, something unreadable in her eyes. "I suppose you got what you wanted." Isaiah exhaled slowly. "This was never about what I wanted, Rebecca. This was about the truth." For once, she didn't have a comeback. And outside the studio, the world was already deciding what came next. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, the Langford report was already unraveling in real time. Rebecca sat stiffly in her chair as her crew rushed around her, murmuring into headsets, checking their phones. She could see it in their faces, the way their eyes darted toward her, the way some avoided looking at her at all. She wasn't just the host anymore. She was the story. Isaiah stood, adjusting his blazer. He wasn't gloating, wasn't celebrating. He had come here to have an honest conversation, and now it was out of his hands. A young producer hesitated near Rebecca's desk. You should see this," he mumbled, holding out his phone. Rebecca snatched it, her eyes scanning the screen. Tweets, video clips, news articles. It was everywhere. The headlines weren't kind. Rebecca Langford silenced on live TV. Businessman calls out talk show host's hypocrisy, and she can't handle it. The moment that changed the Langford report forever. Her grip tightened on the phone. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, standing abruptly. But it wasn't ridiculous. It was real. Her usual supporters, the audience she had carefully cultivated over the years, were split. Some defended her, insisting she had been ambushed. But others were seeing what they had ignored before, that she hadn't debated Isaiah. She had deflected, dodged, and when she lost control, she got defensive. Even worse, the sponsors were pulling out. Her producer hesitated before speaking again. "Two of our biggest advertisers just called. They're reconsidering their contracts." Rebecca's heart pounded. "They wouldn't." "They would," he corrected. "They are." She didn't hear the rest. She stormed off set, phone in hand, scrolling through the avalanche of reactions. Isaiah, meanwhile, walked calmly toward the exit, shaking hands with one of the crew members. He had done what he came here to do. Not to destroy Rebecca, not to win an argument, but to expose something bigger. A reporter caught him just as he stepped outside. "Mr. Brooks, any comment on what happened tonight?" Isaiah paused, thoughtful. Then he said, "It was never about me versus her. It was about whether or not people are willing to hear the truth, even when it makes them uncomfortable." The clip of that response went viral too. And Rebecca? She spent the next few days watching her empire crumble. She tried damage control, released a carefully worded statement about productive discourse and different perspectives. But people weren't buying it. She had built her career shutting down conversations like the one she had just lost. And now the world was watching her face the consequences. Because when the truth finally breaks through, no amount of spin can put it back in the box.